Hello there, beer nerds. This is the Beer by the Numbers podcast, the only educational podcast that encourages you to consume beer while you listen. I'm your host, Ryan, and it's time for episode number 3. And today I want to talk about a concept that is much discussed in the wine world, but is hardly ever talked about when it comes to beer. It's the thing the most obsessive of winos will talk about incessantly, the famously French concept of terroir. I got the inspiration to cover this topic after reading a story in Draft magazine about the most famous Trappist monk beer in the world, Chimay. Let me read you the first handful of lines from that story. In the fall of 1991, the monks at Abbey Notre-Dame de Scourmont in the south of Belgium contracted with monks at the Dutch Abbey Kingshoven to brew Chimay Blanche because construction at their own brewery limited their production. To ensure the beer tasted no different than the Blanche brewed at Chimay, workers filled tanker trucks with water that would be shipped to Kingshoven. Chimay already operated a thoroughly modern facility with brewing engineers capable of manipulating the water, adding minerals, subtracting minerals, in theory, providing a formula to perfectly replicate Chimay's water in the Netherlands rather than hauling it more than 100 miles north. But it would not have been the same water, nor the same beer. This article got me thinking, why would these monks go through the tough and expensive task of hauling water hundreds of miles when surely they had enough experience to replicate their beer almost perfectly? But perhaps, in all their wisdom, the monks who brew Chimay know something that I don't. That sometimes place is more important than process. And that's the spirit behind the French term terroir. According to Webster's dictionary, terroir is a set of special characteristics that geography, geology, and climate of a certain place, interacting with plant genetics, and how it's expressed in agricultural products. So today we're going to examine how place impacts beer. And I think a good way to go about doing that is to look at each of the 4 main ingredients in beer: water, malt, hops, and yeast. So without any further ado, let's dive into the ingredient that makes up most of your beer, water. So it's pretty obvious that the monks knew something that we don't, otherwise they wouldn't have spent thousands of euros hauling water across the countryside. Of course, brewing monks are sticklers for history and tradition, but when we talk about brewing traditions in Europe and the origin of the wide variety of beer styles there, most beer nerds focus on things like the taxation of certain ingredients at certain times, or certain wild yeasts, or even weird laws like the German Reinheitsgebot purity law. But the more I study beer history, the more convinced I am that the primary driver of what beer styles brewers chose to brew was driven by the nature of the water that was available to them. How do you answer questions like, why were stouts and porters so popular in London and Dublin? Why was the pale ale born in Burton-upon-Trent? And why do clean lagers like the Pilsner come from areas like Pilsen? You can probably already guess, but the answer is differences in the natural water chemistry in those areas. If we look at London and Dublin's water supply, we see high levels of bicarbonate in the water. The bicarbonate in water supply affects the pH of the water, raising it to much higher levels than normal. Yeasts don't perform particularly well in high pH conditions, so brewers tried a variety of things to help their yeast ferment to their fullest potential. Eventually, they found that using darker roasted barley really helped the yeast thrive. Of course, using roasted barley makes your beer darker. Although brewers didn't know it at the time, it also lowers the pH of the water, allowing the yeast to thrive. This is why we associate London and Dublin with darker beers today. And you can contrast that example with the Czech town of Pilsen, which has very soft and pure water. Brewers there were able to brew beers with very light and refreshing taste profiles, and that could showcase all the subtle flavors contained in the local hops. Through much of brewing history, if you wanted to make a great beer, you had to pick ingredients and styles that played nicely with your local water supply. Thanks to many advances in chemistry, brewers today don't have to worry so much about the nuances of their local water, and are able to brew a variety of styles really well by adding and subtracting from what comes in through the pipes. But even so, many brewers, including the Trappist monks, are still obsessed with using the unique water profiles that nature provides to make truly excellent beer. Next, let's move on to malt. Malt is the backbone of any beer. It provides all the sugars yeast need to work their magic to turn wort into beer. Malt also provides the most of the base flavor compounds in the final beer as well, so it's pretty dang important when it comes to developing a taste profile. The amounts of sugars present in the malt, as well as the ratio of the compounds that are turned into flavoring agents by the yeast, can be affected by geography and weather patterns. There are a nearly endless list of factors that can impact the production of barley for malting. Things like local soil composition and microclimate can influence individual growing seasons, but once you add in factors like the dozens of varieties of malting barley that are grown, from 2-row to 6-row types, to spring and winter strains of barley, it's not really surprising that these variables present a seemingly endless number of influences affecting the taste and character of finished beer. While researching barley, I found that the requirements for malting quality barley are actually surprisingly strict, and each farmer who grows it must pay particular attention to all these factors in order to produce a suitable product. The costs are higher and the risks are greater, but there are rewards there too. Malting barley cannot contain excessive protein content, which can cause haze and lautering problems in brewing. You can't have any blighted or broken or damaged kernels, and your crop must have a 95% germination rate, among many other qualifications. If it doesn't meet one of a dozen standards, it's only good on secondary markets as feed, which means much less money for the farmer. And yet, despite all these factors, it would seem that in practical applications, malt doesn't really add much in the way of terroir to beer. With large-scale industrialization of agriculture, there has been a homogenization of most crops, and malting barley is no exception to this trend. Although this might be bad news for local beer and terroir enthusiasts, it's been largely good news for brewers, as it allows a significantly more product consistency. But there are a small and growing number of independent maltsters and barley growers who are trying to revive the local grain spirit that once thrived in the industry. Although the process of tracking down these suppliers can be a pain, and their product is more expensive, it can be worth it for the discerning brewer who wants to create a very special malt profile for their beers. These maltsters are growing with demand, so in the future we will probably see more local malts being used at your neighborhood brewery. If you talk to brewers and hop growers, they'll tell you that hops are the best way to discern some terroir in your beer. If you ask a beer nerd like me what a citra hop tastes like, or what a noble hop like Fuggle smells like, I'd be able to give you a nice little description of a few characteristics of each that would set them apart from other hops. But if you asked a hop grower the same question, they would probably tell you that the idea of a hop variety having a single set of personality traits is misguided. They know that no two citras are the same. From state to state, country to country, year to year, or even row to row on the same farm, the quote-unquote same hops can deliver markedly different flavors to the finished beer. Brewer Mike Hoops from Town Hall Brewery remembers traveling to Yakima to select hops and learning just how different a varietal can taste. He said in an interview, "We have done sensory testing on Eldorado cuts that showed extreme fruity orange citrus flavors all the way to herbal fresh-cut grash on the same table from the same farm." He recalls, "Our approach to single hop beers at Town Hall has been to embrace that deviation." But when the conversation turns to how much of those differences are due to terroir, the answer is a little less black and white. The effects of terroir are likely overshadowed by the effects of other, more prominent factors. The largest impact on hop characteristics is how well they're grown, harvested, and packaged, explains Eric Sonnerud, co-founder of Mighty Axe Hops. By far, that matters the most. Something like 80 to 90% of hop quality is all in the harvesting and growing techniques. There are definite differences from, say, Cascade grown in the Yakima Valley versus Cascade hops grown in Germany. Even within hops grown in the same region, there is variability from year to year, and even variability within the same year. This actually creates a big challenge for brewers. Customers expect their flagship beers to have the same excellent taste year in and year out. As soon as a change is noticed by the public, it usually comes along with comments like, "This beer isn't as good as it used to be," or "This brewer seems to have lost their touch," or maybe, "This brewer is cheaping out on their ingredients," even though the brewer could have used the same suppliers, recipes, and techniques that they have always used for that beer. So how do brewers tone down the amount of terroir present in hops? Well, for most brewers, it means blending together the same variety of hops from several different sources to try to minimize differences in tastes and aromas. But as beer drinkers get smarter and more interested as to why the beers they love taste the way they do, hop terroir is becoming a more popular concept that local brewers are trying to capitalize on. This has led to some brewers and even university agricultural programs to begin to try to empirically study hop terroir. If they are able to develop some numerical measurements of how place impacts hops, brewers may be able to create some great custom beers and have those experimental ales be more consistent from batch to batch and year to year. The final and most important ingredient in beer can add extreme variability in beer due to place. Way back in brewing history, before humanity had any understanding of microbiology, the only way to ferment your beer was allowing wild yeast to grow in your wort and work their yeasty magic. Although the exact microbiology contained in beer is really complex, the two most useful wild yeasts are those in the Saccharomyces and Brettanomyces families. Yeast can be found on a variety of surfaces in nature, like fruits and plants, in the soil, or even in tree sap. They seem to thrive in environments where there are a lot of simple sugars around, like ripe fruits. These yeasts can produce a variety of unique flavor profiles that are often very different every time. But as we discussed before with hops, this is not really a great thing for brewers who have to meet the expectations of the drinking public. Almost all brewers use lab-grown yeast today for the sake of consistency, so most wild yeasts are regarded as a contaminant rather than something to be embraced. But there are a few styles that embrace natural yeasts. Lambics are beers that are spontaneously fermented in the San Valley region of Belgium. They encourage both Saccharomyces and Brettanomyces to lend their special flavor profiles to the beer. For the production of lambics, the hot wort brewers make is cooled while being exposed to the ambient brewery environment, which invites inoculation of wild yeast from the air. The local flora of the wild yeast and bacteria is thought to give the beers of each brewery their unique taste, and it is often said that the microbes for these fermenting lambics take up residence in the cobwebs of the breweries. The more likely scenario is that the microbes for lambic fermentation live in the porous wood beams and fermentation vessels inside the breweries. These microbes are often local to the brewery, producing the lambic. So certain lambics can't be reproduced in another location because the brewery does not have the same natural flora. Such differences may be said to represent part of terroir for these unique beers. I would say that yeast represents the greatest possibility for terroir in beer because it can come from the most different places. After all, you can brew beer almost anywhere, but you can't grow barley or hops anywhere, so the amount of variety you can get in wild yeast is virtually unlimited and represents a huge opportunity for beer customization in the future. If only brewers could figure out how to ensure the unpredictable nature of these yeasts don't get too out of hand. I know we said we were going to look at the 4 main ingredients, but while I was researching this podcast, I found one more element of terroir that I want to discuss. Every chef has a favorite seasoned pan, and there are certain elements of brewing equipment that can lend a unique flavor profile that can't be reproduced at other breweries and with other equipment. The monks at Abbey Notre Dame de Orval learned this concept the hard way in 1950. John de Klerk, a famed brewing scientist, advised his brewers to scrub out the beer stone, which was a calcium buildup that had accumulated in the lagering tanks over the course of more than a dozen years. He thought it might produce some wild flavors. Soon, customers complained that the Goût de Orval, translated to the taste of Orval, that beer's flavor had been lost. It wasn't until a decade later that Orval was able to reclaim this once uncherished concept that had defined who they were. Certain special elements of brewing equipment seem to bring a bit of terroir of their own. So the next time you settle down to a pint of beer, you can nerd out about the variety of factors that go into crafting that perfect flavor. Whether it's a unique water profile, a hop plant that got too much sun, or a special calcium buildup stone that lends a little extra touch of flavor, terroir most certainly plays a factor in the brew that ends up in your glass. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Beer by the Numbers podcast. For those of you who aren't familiar with my Beer by the Numbers YouTube content, I am just a nerd who is very, very passionate about beer, and I just want to share that passion with as many people as I possibly can. You know, oftentimes I think beer is looked at as kind of a low-class drink, and although I think the craft beer industry is doing a great job of shattering this perception, I want to make sure this isn't some passing fad by creating a community that is excited and passionate about beer and fans who love learning about beer. If you want to join me in this mission, check the links in the description and head over to the Beer by the Numbers Facebook fan page. Let me know you're a listener and I will let you in. There, we are building a community of passionate beer lovers, and I'm sure you'll appreciate all the great discussion going on. And if you haven't been to the Beer by the Numbers YouTube channel, what in the world are you waiting for? I have 2 years worth of videos there, so you really should check it out and subscribe if you like what you find. Before I go, it is once again time for our nightcap numbers related to today's episode number, and for episode 3, I wanted to give you 3 great facts about the world's favorite 3-letter beer style, the IPA. Unlike most beers in England at the time, the IPA was meant to be drunk as cold as possible. The lower serving temperature was said to make the beer more refreshing and bring out its great hoppy flavors. The first place to coin the name IPA was actually in Australia. While Australia was not the first place to brew an IPA, they were the first place to call it one. The name East India Pale Ale appeared in an 1829 ad printed in the Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser, but the ad didn't mention the brewery that was making it. Finally, New England or Northeast IPAs are the fastest growing substyles of IPAs. They've only been around a little more than a year and a half, but already they are sweeping the brewing world quickly, and drinkers just can't seem to get enough of the haze craze. Once again, this has been Ryan with Beer by the Numbers, and I'll see you next time with more great beer content. Cheers.